The year was 1885, and Queen's Park of Scotland sought revenge against Blackburn Rovers in the 14th ever FA Cup final. The previous year, Blackburn had won 2-0 in controversial circumstances when the referee had not awarded a goal to Queen's Park because, according to the ref, even though the ball had crossed the goal line, Queen's Park Rangers hadn't claimed for it. Yes, these were different times. Then, when Blackburn won it for the second year in a row, controversy reigned supreme yet again. This time, however, it was because Blackburn had started Accrington Stanley loanee George Howarth. According to football historian Paul Brown, Rovers had 3 loan players, and the FA at the time had convened secretly before the quarterfinals to forbid these loan players from participating further in the competition. Yet, inexplicably, Howarth was allowed to play in the final. Brown, writing for 442, goes on to say that leading newspaper Athletic News was heavily critical of the loaning of players for cup ties, calling it, quote, objectionable and unfair proceeding, end quote. Another journalist of the time said, quote, when will something be done to check the wholesale system of borrowing players to help a club escape or pull through the test fixtures? This led to the FA in 1898 banning, quote, the loaning and borrowing of players for special matches. So really at the time it was a way of getting a competitive advantage with players from other teams, much like many five-a-side leagues do today. It wasn't until the Second World War that England temporarily adopted loans again due to a shortage of players. Fast forward to 1966, and the Football League decided to change the rules to re-allow loans. However, there were restrictions, like clubs couldn't make more than 2 loans per season, loan fees could not be paid, loans had to be for at least 3 months, and they could only be made between clubs in different divisions. Like many rules, it was met with resistance, but ultimately accepted. In the decades that follow, small rule changes would be made, but nothing seismic. That's a brief history of the last 100 years of loans, but what about recent history? What about today? Coming up, we speak with writer and broadcaster Daniel Storey, who wrote a piece about loans in the newspaper this week, and ask, how have loans evolved since the 1990s, and are loans damaging football in 2020? When you were growing up in Nottingham in the 1990s, how common were loans? Are we talking about 2 or 3 players on loan back then, 7 or 8? How common were they?
Very uncommon, actually. From my memory of growing up, certainly the players who I had an affinity with were Nottingham Forest players through and through. The 2 players that stick out, probably early 2000s rather than 90s, but Nottingham Forest had John Terry on loan from Chelsea. I think he played 6 times, and that was very much just getting him experience. It was a short-term loan, and he went back to Chelsea, and I think they were always clear that he was going to break into the first team. And the other one was Aaron Ramsey from Arsenal, who came and was clearly a good player, but it wasn't enough that he was a good player. It wasn't enough. He kind of flitted in and out of the team. He was clearly excellent. He was clearly pretty raw. But the reality of the team is that the manager at the time wanted experience and wasn't particularly sold on the idea of building a team around, particularly in central midfield, building a team around a young player who's only going to be there for a short period of time, which I think is probably one of the inherent flaws of the loan system.
You kind of alluded to it there, that it seems like most of the loans back then were just to give guys experience, or maybe it was something else.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was young players being sent out on loan purely to gain experience, which to an extent now still happens on the part of the parent club for sure. But I think over time that has been transformed or warped, depending on your viewpoint, into EFL clubs, Football League clubs, taking players as a potential season changer or a game changer in pursuit of promotion. We look at the example that springs to mind is Tammy Abraham at Aston Villa last season, where his arrival was used as a fuel to get Villa into the Premier League, as a mean to avoiding a very expensive permanent transfer, and as a means to falsely inflating their league position. And when it came to January and they needed a central defender, they did the same with Tyrone Mings from Bournemouth. Mings was slightly different in that he wasn't getting any football at Bournemouth and he'd had injury problems, so he did need regular football. But in my mind, it's been warped from let's give this young player some experience to hang on a minute, this player could get us up into the Premier League.
And on that note, we're seeing with Aston Villa this year kind of what happens when you have all of these loan players and obviously you can't keep them all.
Yeah, absolutely. They were fortunate in they were able to make a couple of those loans deals permanent, Tyrone Mings being the obvious example. But the inherent problem of loan players is that by their very nature, they're a short-term fix. They are not a permanent fix. If it gets you to the Premier League, then Aston Villa may well consider that to be financially worth it, even if they go down straight away. But it does cause a vacuum, a gap when those players depart. How could it not? Especially a player like Tammy Abraham, who you build your whole attack round. You then buy another striker in Wesley, who is a very different profile and has not performed as well and is taking time to settle in England. And it's not hard to see why they're having problems this season. I honestly believe that if Villa had the same team as last year, they'd be doing better in the Premier League than they are now.
Just to put this in perspective, how many more loan deals are there now than 20 plus years ago in the 90s when we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, there's a really interesting piece of Financial Times analysis. I wrote a piece recently about my concerns for the loan system without using historical data, but this Financial Times analysis has that historical data. It says that in 1992, 6% of transfers were loans in Europe's top 5 leagues, and this year it's up to 29%, which is a pretty extraordinary change. This is post-Bosman, so there's not been any huge regulation change that would allow this. It's a purely behavioural change. It's purely on clubs wanting to improve their squads on a temporary basis. And this is only top leagues. This is not looking down to the EFL. This is not looking down at clubs using this as a boost to get promotion. This is purely top league stuff, which, I think is fascinating.
It's a pretty staggering number. That's about 5 times what it was in 1992 is what it is today. I want to unpack maybe some of the reasoning for that. What are some of the reasons why it's particularly higher even in England than some of the other leagues, although not all of them?
The reason that jumps out to me is the financial strength of the big 6 clubs now. The rise in squad depth, huge squads. The rise in signing players younger and cheaper as a means to create a squad that is almost, they consider, foolproof, bomb-proof. So they can therefore loan those players out to get experience, but ostensibly they are, being scouted by their own clubs. They're being sent out on loan. They're then being scouted by loan managers and coaches and scouts to see their qualities on the pitch, and then in a very small number of cases they will then make the grade at the parent club. The reality is that in the large percentage of cases that doesn't happen, but I think the growing gap between the big 6 and the rest means that loaning young players even within the same division, because they can't play against you but can play against everyone else, becomes a pretty viable tactic.
You mentioned Eddie Nketiah in your piece, and he plays for Arsenal. He's 20 years old, and he's one of the most talented players in his age group in the country. But I think he serves as a pretty good symbol for the modern loan industry. How so?
Firstly, there were a number of clubs in for him from the Championship, and by all reports, Arsenal asked for those clubs to present their cases to Arsenal as to why they should be the golden ticket winners, that they should be allowed to get Eddie on loan, and Leeds won that. He then went to Leeds and has only started 2 matches, both of which when it became clear that Arsenal were wanting him back from Leeds. And has now returned to Arsenal and will be sent out on loan again for the next few months, which is, for Arsenal's point of view, makes complete sense. They want him to get as much football as they can, probably with a view to selling him rather than a view to him breaking into the team, if I'm honest. But for the Championship clubs, it's a very, very difficult balance, because he's clearly a talented boy, but he's still raw. And Leeds United are, automatic promotion is their ultimate game this season, and therefore managers don't want to necessarily take a chance on a raw talent. They want guarantees. They want a stable system. They don't want someone who might be whisked away in 2 months and leaving that hole in the team.
So, these big clubs are now taking pitches for their young, talented players. And I know that they've now created a loans manager position. So this clearly kind of just shows how big business these loans are now.
Yeah, it reminds me of an example from another industry. I remember hearing about Tesco, the biggest supermarket in the UK, who, when they wanted to get a new supply deal in, they would get 4 or 5 competitors in the same room and effectively play them off against each other in a bid to drive down the price and get a better quality of product. And it's not a million miles away from that. We talk about football as big business and footballers as a commercial entity rather than a sporting one. And I think that hits it home. The fact that Arsenal are in such a powerful position that they can effectively invite clubs to come cap in hand and make their case for why they should be allowed to have this player for a while. And let's be honest, pay for the privilege. Yeah, I mean, it hammers all of that home. It really does. And the fact that Arsenal still have the power to take that player back as and when they wish and send him out again as and when they wish, which is not necessarily in the best interest of the player, I don't think.
You say it's not in the best interest of the player. You mentioned that he only played 2 games at Leeds and he's expected to go out on loan for, the second half of the season. What are some of the ripple effects of this different or slightly bigged up version of the loan system?
I think for players, it's a really, really hard balance because, Eddie Nketiah wants minutes. This matters for the rest of his career. What he does between the ages of 19 and 22, and he's in the middle of that range now, matters for his future career. He is in the shop window wherever he goes because, as I say, I don't think he will make it at Arsenal. He already has 3 first-team strikers ahead of him, and they bought Gabriel Martinelli this season, who is younger than him and has played more than him in Arsenal's team already. So this is an opportunity for Eddie to develop. Now, that's very hard to do when you're firstly in and out of the team that you've been sent to, and secondly, when you're going on various loans in various systems under various managers. There's an argument to say that can be beneficial, getting different experience of different systems, but young players crave stability as well. This craves stability in their coaching. If you go to Leeds and you're taught to play one way, you've been at Arsenal where you've been taught to play another way. He might well go on loan to Bristol City where he's taught to play a third way. That can be quite hard for a young player to manage, and it can genuinely be defining for the rest of their career.
Yeah, I mean, we have countless examples of this. All you have to do is look at Chelsea. Patrick Bamford is a great example. He was on loan every year between 2011 and 2018 from Chelsea.
We're joined here by new Norwich City signing Patrick Bamford.
Patrick, you joined the club on a season-long loan. Why Palace?
Patrick, I suppose the easy way into this is, at last, welcome to Middlesbrough.
And we're seeing his ability now, but maybe we would have seen it earlier if he hadn't had all those loans.
Yeah, he's a really good example. He came from originally my club, Nottingham Forest. He was sold for £1 million to Chelsea after playing, I think, 3 first-team games for Forest. And it's hard for those young players because when a big club comes calling, it's very, very difficult to say no. Football is a fragile career. If he sustains a very bad, let's say, a ligament injury at Forest and having turned down that move, things can fall away very quickly. So it is hard to say no. He must have gone into that with both eyes open. He must have known that at Chelsea it would have been very hard to break into the first team. But those young players are taught to be confident. They're taught to grab opportunities like this. The reality is that it then leads to, as you say, a series of loan moves in which we don't know. It's completely unquantifiable. We don't know how good Bamford would have been if he'd have played in that Chelsea first team for a year. He may well have been a top-class striker by now, but the reality is that Chelsea have the financial resources to spend big on ready-made players. They don't need to take a chance on someone like Bamford.
Are there any unintended consequences of this new loan system, maybe even further down the football chain?
Yeah, there are. What we have to remember is that, EFL clubs that are taking these players, they have their own young players. They have players who also want to make the grade at their clubs in exactly the same scenario, but just further down the ladder. And the knock-on effect is such that their young players maybe don't get a chance because if you're a championship manager, and I think the average length of tenure is about 18 months for a championship manager, you're under severe pressure. If you get told that you can take a striker from Arsenal who's meant to be the next big thing, Why wouldn't you do that? If your club's resources allow that, why wouldn't you bring him in? If Bamford had got injured this season at Leeds, then Nketiah would have played more. So it's a lot easier for those managers to, again, take that easy route out that's available to you. I think regulation is the only way this is going to be managed. We're never going to be able to sit down with managers and say, hang on a minute, maybe you should care more about your own young players, because the reality is if they lose 3 games in a row, then they're immediately under pressure and young players make mistakes.
We kind of alluded to it earlier, but loans feel inherently flawed because at the end of the day, the parent team is looking to develop a player while the loan club only cares about the production. Is it possible to kind of reconcile that difference of motivation? And is this system failing football right now?
I think it is failing the players. I think, and I honestly believe, although they may consider it worth the gamble, I think it's also failing the Football League clubs as well, because football now is an incredibly short-termist sport. It's an impatient sport. It's a demanding sport. It's everything it promised to become when it welcomed rampant capitalism 20 years ago. And yeah, I think the only people that truly benefit in the loan system as it is now is those elite clubs. If they can be allowed to farm players, have 15, 20 players out on loan, and then maybe one of them makes it into the first team and the others are sold for considerable profit, then they're doing their thing right. They're more than happy with that situation. I think everyone else, ultimately, if not in the short term, suffers because of it.
You know, I want to kind of expand the focus of this from, not even just England, but to all of Europe. It seems like a lot more high-profile players and bigger players are moving on loans. Is that something that you're seeing as well? And if so, what do you think the reasons of that are?
My favourite example from this season is Philippe Coutinho, who has gone from a big Champions League club with ambitions of winning that trophy to another Champions League club with ambitions of winning that trophy.
Well, it looks like Philippe Coutinho has been given, I don't really want to call it an olive branch, guys, because a player of his quality, it's hard to think that he was looking for a second chance somewhere. But of course, he's going from Barcelona to Bayern Munich on loan.
I think there's effectively 2 loan systems at play here. There's elite to non-elite, which is generally a domestic system, so Premier League players to non-Premier League clubs. And then there's an elite to elite market, which is generally more cross-border. It's generally intra-big league, intra-big 5 league clubs. It's the big 6 or the big 4 or the big 5 in each one of those leagues, trading players to each other on a kind of try before you buy basis. The reasons for that are, as soon as an elite player, feels that he's being moved to the fringes of a big club, and that's what was happening to Coutinho at Barcelona. I think the agent wants him to stay in the firing line or stay in the headlines. The player wants to stay in the headlines, and the parent club wants to probably reduce their wage bill and ultimately sell that player at a high price. And if the player's sat in the reserves for a season, his value obviously drops. So it makes sense for those clubs. Again, if they can't play against their parent club in that competition, that hugely helps them as well. So yeah, I think this kind of try before you buy with elite players, we saw it with Bayern and James Rodriguez, we're seeing it with Coutinho. I think that is the future. And it's not a future I particularly like, to be honest. It feels very manufactured. It feels very false and again, short term.
According to the Financial Times, that article that we referenced earlier, they gave a stat that only 28 loans that were loan to buy happened 10 years ago. And that number is up to 101 this year. So that's almost 4 times the amount in a decade, just to kind of prove your point. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't really, because, again, elite clubs now have the financial resources, to use a phrase I used earlier, to try and make themselves bomb-proof, to have so many options in the squad that if the worst happens and they suffer an injury crisis, that there are players to step in. But the reality is that is only planning for an emergency, and emergencies don't happen very often. So what you end up with is a fairly large collection of potentially senior international footballers not getting that many league minutes. Most clubs use between 20 and 25 players regularly across the whole of the season, and the rest are left on the shelf. Even a large portion of those 20 to 25 players wouldn't be happy with the status they have within their squad. So the reality now with the rise of the super agent is that those players, are angling after moves, maybe even 3 or 4 games into a season if they feel like they haven't got the status they believe they deserve. So larger squads means more players left on the shelf, which means more players available for transfer, which means more going out on loan to preserve their value.
So FIFA looked at the loan system last year and thought it really wasn't the way it should be. And this year in September, they announced new changes to the loan system, limiting clubs to 8 players that they can loan overseas. Do you see that fixing any of the problems that we mentioned?
It's an attempted fix, it should be said. And also it should be said that the new rules are going to apply from next season to only players aged 22 or over. So it doesn't really stop that idea of buying 16, 17, 18-year-olds for cheap and then loaning them out abroad. That will still happen. We talked about Chelsea earlier. They are the highest profile example of a club that looks to use the loan system to its full capacity. They currently have 12 players aged 22 or over, I think, out on loan to overseas clubs, and that will have to be reduced to 8. But if you look at some of those names, Alvaro Morata, Baba Rahman, Kennedy, Timuri Bakayoko, David Zappacosta, these are established senior international footballers in most of those cases. So they will be forced, I think, to sell those players more often than loan them. If so, great. But 8 is still a pretty high number for over 22-year-olds and only to be loaned abroad. They will still be able to loan as many as they want under that age and as many as they want domestically.
So it feels like kind of a small alteration, but not like a drastic overhaul.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason for that. And the obvious reason for that is that the power of the elite clubs has never been greater. They've long been discussing or threatening some sort of breakaway or alteration to the Champions League to benefit themselves, whether that's ring-fencing the competition or breaking away entirely. And FIFA and UEFA have to appease them because they have more power than the governing bodies now. That's the sad, in my opinion, reality of it. So they can only do so much. They can only do things incrementally, and they can only ruffle the feathers of those big clubs. Because if they go further than that, then they risk annoying those clubs in a climate where those clubs are already threatening pretty drastic action.
It seems pretty clear that you're not super in favor of FIFA's changes. What would you do differently?
Well, there's 2 solutions that I believe could and should happen, but the should is a lot stronger than the could, because again, we are effectively asking turkeys to vote for Christmas here. The first is that I think there should be a ban on the long-term loans of players over 24. So to look at that list I said before, that's the Bakayoko, that's the Rahman, that's the Alvaro Morata. There should be, if there's a ban on those, it then, I think, persuades the elite clubs, firstly, that they should sell those players rather than loaning them. At the moment, it's a kind of out of sight, out of mind thing. We don't have to think about Morata until next summer because he's away on loan, his wages are being covered, we don't really need to think about it. And I think that is unhealthy. The second is, which I think would be more effective and perhaps even more realistic, would be a mandatory clause within the contracts of young players when they sign that allows them to break their contract at the end of every year if they have not met a certain number of games for their parent club. Now, that's a mandatory clause in the contract. It doesn't mean that those players have to break those contracts. To be honest, in the large percentage of cases, they probably wouldn't break those contracts. They'd choose to stay there. But it does, to an extent, remove the power from the clubs, the elite clubs, and hand it back to the players, because player power in English football is seen as for a long time was seen as a negative thing. It was seen as a damaging thing. But actually, I would much rather have power in the hands of those players than in the hands of the elite clubs.
It's just so interesting in football compared to almost any other sport. Player power is pretty significant, and yet in this kind of situation, it's actually not.
there's really interesting cases where I won't mention any names because they are only reported cases, but where young players have signed new contracts and then been sent out on loan. And supporters often think, well, why would you sign a new contract if you know you're just going to be sent out on loan? But actually the reality is that the elite clubs will say to that player, if you don't sign a new contract, then we won't send you out on loan. You'll just stay at our club and play under 23 football and not get any competitive action. So in that sense, the players they're effectively being emotionally blackmailed by the club to say, well, look, you're going to have to sign a new contract if you want to play any football. So they do sign that contract, and therefore they are trapped in that same cycle. This contract clause would allow them to take back some of that control and say, well, hang on a minute, I have no faith in me making the grade at this club. I have no faith in you believing even that I'll make the grade. So why can't I go and seize control of my own destiny?
Daniel Storey is a football writer and broadcaster whose work can be found on the BBC, the iPaper, the Totally Football Show, and elsewhere. The show is produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and this was Football Today. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.